Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Kevin Dolan. I'm the writer and author of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. I'm going to read chapter 20 today. The title of it is Giving Up What Weighed Me Down, and it begins on page 126 of my memoir. It's vital to close the past before we move forward. I've discovered it's one of the gifts I've learned so that I can actually live in the present. To acknowledge how influential my experiences were. I honor the lessons my family taught me. I thank them for being who they were, for gifting me with memories I might never have had elsewhere. I can now affirm that life happens for me and not to me. To have humbled me by allowing me to recognize that we weren't all that different. Do I believe they were doing the best they could? Yes. Was life hard? Yes. Was I traumatized? Definitely. Was it love? I believe it was. To my family, I am who I am because of you. I carry you always. I let you go. What I braved. But dear, I can't hold his hands, whispered my mum, as she walked away from the casket that held her fifth-born son's body. A few weeks earlier, he had taken his own life. My heart sank because I had not remembered that Mum always held her kid's hands, and it seemed even death was not about to stop her. I had the funeral director move my brother's arms from alongside his body so that his hands were folded on his chest. Mum returned to her baby's side and then gently looked up at me and mouthed, "Thank you, dear." As a way to support my brother's girlfriend in her grief and to help herd the Dolans, I flew to Victoria a few days earlier to arrange the funeral. For some strange reason, I was the one in the Dolan family who buried them. With a pretty solid comprehension of the impact of death, I understood many of the responses family and friends had to my brother's suicide. The range was silence, certainly because of the suicide, right up to denial. The 5 stages of grief were all well played out during the proceedings. My brother was the youngest of the older group of Dolans. The elder of the group, my oldest sister, was having a terrible time with her baby brother's death. I am aware of the dynamic of narcissism, a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance and a deep need for excessive attention and admiration. I always sensed that Mum was a narcissist. What sprang to life at this funeral was my awareness of how my mum felt like she was the only one entitled to feel what she was feeling because of her son's death. She'd shh people when their emotions became too loud for her liking. I heard her tell my older sister, "Don't be so stupid, keep it together." It was embarrassing to watch her pull as much attention to herself from the incident as she could. It was done at the expense of my other siblings and other family members, who were really confused by her antics. Over a few days, the formalities unfolded. The family viewing, the evening of prayers, and finally, the funeral. I was exhausted. I remember looking down from atop the pulpit in the church where the funeral was held while reading a passage from the Bible. I watched as Mum behaved like she was the only person who had endured a loss. It pissed me off. After witnessing her attempts to control who felt what and how mean she had been to my older sister, I decided not to go to my brother's girlfriend's place after the funeral. I'd skipped the standard post-funeral meet and greet. I went directly to the hotel and then back home to Calgary. I remember this strange sense of being overwhelmed very quickly when I spent too much time concentrated with my family. I had become full and needed to run, so I did. Mum finally arrived home, and I remember stopping by to check in on her. I also remember wanting to tell her that I noticed how mean she had been to my sister. After receiving the usual hug from her and a handhold that led me into her home, I gently asked how she was. Her response was quick and had nothing to do with the question I asked. "Can you believe how selfish your sister was being at the funeral? I could have slapped her," was her reply. I felt stunned by how quickly she replied with some semblance of compassion. "Mum, I think it might have been you who was being selfish. She was devastated that her little brother died by suicide. In my lifetime, Mom has shot many a glance my way, oftentimes accompanied by a blistering right-hand slap. This time, I heard nothing. I uncomfortably shifted in my chair and added, "It dawned on me that if you can treat one of my siblings like that, it's probably safe to assume that you might treat me the same way." I felt fear in me well up, but I was proud to have spoken my truth. In what felt like watching a car crash in slow motion, my mom turned to me, shifted to the end of the swivel chair, and said, "If you're afraid of how I'm going to treat you, then perhaps you should leave. Go ahead. I don't need anybody else stealing the show from me." There it was, the narcissist. I felt appalled. What I braved that day was speaking my truth to power, Dolan power. I felt good choosing to speak. The unlearning. When you come from a family that does nothing but live in the past, leaving it where it belongs can be a monumental task. One of the ways I kept from drowning in Dolan dysfunction was to surround myself with wise teachers. Many of them graced the front of classrooms, but many more were listened to via audio cassette series or self-empowerment books. Dr. Wayne Dyer was one of the first teachers of transformation that I read and listened to. I think I gravitated to his teachings because he was abandoned as a little boy and had to grow up in an orphanage, always present to feeling angry, not being acknowledged, and having to look after himself. He tells a story about finding the grave of his father, who left him, his mom, and younger siblings when he was a little boy. He had never met his dad. What floored me about this story was his ability to forgive his father. He'd say it was one of the most profound pieces of freedom he'd ever given himself. There was really no separation between me and my family. I was not better than they were. What I did constantly do, that perhaps my family members didn't do, was to search for a way of being that felt easier. Somehow, I knew life didn't have to be as hard as my family sold it out as being. The idea of forgiveness felt complicated to me. I had no role models for this act. If anything, all I heard was Mom constantly saying, "I'll never forgive your father for what he did." Even after my dad died, Mom still wouldn't forgive him. I was placing a lot of faith in the notion of forgiveness. My head pointed me in the direction of forgiving my family, but my heart led me to the wisdom of teachings connected to the Adult Children of Alcoholics program, ACOA. I chose to join the group. I was terrified. A pamphlet laid on the table in front of me when I sat down for my first meeting. It read, "As children, we were affected in mind, body, and spirit by alcoholism and other family dysfunction. Our bodies stored the trauma, neglect, and rejection in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. The mind developed a false sense, to survive. The inner child, the true connection to our higher power, went into hiding. ACOA recovery can reverse this process." Inner child? Immediately, my well-honed sense of wanting to bolt kicked in. But I managed to breathe through the fear, and I kept my ass in the seat. I didn't run away. It seemed my timing was perfect. The focus of that first meeting was forgiveness. And it wasn't forgiving another, it was forgiving one's self. It was the longest 90 minutes of my life. Over the year and a half I spent with that group, I would learn many pieces of wisdom, the most profound being identifying the need to heal and then establish a connection to my inner child. Little Tommy, my inner boy, did not trust the adult version of who I had become. Growing up, I couldn't keep him safe. In the spirit of ACOA teachings, I had to become my own loving parent. Becoming my own loving parent involved seeing my biological parents as the instruments of my existence. My actual parent was to become my higher power, God, the divine, or the universe, all partners in every step I take in my life today. Over time, I let go of Tom Dolan, the name I associated not only with being straight, but also with a part of me that couldn't or didn't know how to keep me safe. I embraced Thomas Kevin Dolan with much reverence and also with much laughter. Growing up, I refused to use Thomas because I was afraid people would think I was gay. I quickly recognized how I needed to forgive myself. The unlearning for me in all the dynamics of my family had me realize my focus had to be on my inner world. not the semantics of my outer world. After forgiving myself, trusting I'd done the best I could at the time, I could then turn to my family and extend the same grace. Life did become much, much easier. Can you imagine witnessing the antics of your parents at a funeral, pulling all of the attention to them, thinking that only they were the ones that could grieve a loss? Add another layer of complexity, watching your parents put down your siblings for having their feelings, for pulling attention away from them because they should be the only ones that were in pain. At the time, I kind of stood at, I often think and use this analogy for myself, when I find myself deferring to an old way of being, right, an unconscious, an old neural pathway. I call it my familiar. My familiar, that old habit that used to work for me, that I've done some work on. I can catch it from time to time. But in this particular case, it being so long ago, I remember kind of being 500 feet above the circumstance. My mom, I mean, in the church, I was literally in the pulpit, and this pulpit was really high over the congregation, those that had come to honor my brother. But it was like I was above watching, and with that kind of bird's eye view, I could really sense what was going on. On the ground, it was a little bit more difficult to pull the antics apart, but I could see them from above. And I do remember when I didn't have that vantage point in the church, I kind of stepped back and watched these things unfold as my mom pretended that she was the only one who was in pain. And I realized that vantage point was pretty healthy for me. And it would become part of the boundary I would create in reconnecting with my family. So remember, Mom said to me, you should leave, particularly if I was going to be the one to pull attention away from her. Not exactly what I said, but I paraphrase from the book. Really what she was saying was, if you're going to interfere with me getting more attention than I think they deserve in other circumstances, then be gone. I actually spent 3 years away from my mom and my family. And I didn't know at the time when she invited me to leave and I said, I'm going to leave. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do or how I was going to do it. And at the time, it was a response to something that was really challenging for me to hear. But I remember a calmness. I remember taking a breath and really accepting her invitation to leave, trusting that there was something in this for me, and I had no idea what it was. So I spent a year away. I sat on the island of Maui for a year during that time, and essentially when I did return, it wasn't to Calgary, interestingly enough, it was to Vancouver, so more distance, which was great. And of course I would actually never return to Calgary to live. But in that 3 years being separate and apart from my family, but particularly my mom, what I developed for myself was a sense of what the wackiness was about. I began some therapy work in Vancouver. The year in Maui taught me how to listen to my intuition. I learned how to meditate there. And that would be a really great bit of self-soothing for me. A really great way to get a sense of what came up for me physically that I could begin to register that something wasn't working for me. And I remember my entrance back into my family for a visit back from Vancouver. And a former partner said to me at that particular time, how long do you think you can actually be with your mom? And I'd never considered that before when I thought I had to endure, right, the bullshit that came up for her as a narcissist. I had no idea how to endure it. So I did. So I said to this friend at the time, I think I can catch myself. Whether it's 17 seconds, 17 minutes, an hour and 17, or 2 hours and 17. Don't know why I chose 17. But I said, I believe now I can catch the antics. Create a boundary, and if that didn't work, the self-care would be to remove myself from that circumstance, where I wasn't the victim, where I didn't think I had to stick around for the sake of sticking around. Which, still as I tell you that, I can feel that sticking aroundness that was so prevalent and that I endured so much when I was younger. Oh, and I'm so proud of myself to know with circumstances that occur in my life today, where the energy just isn't right, I'm gone. And I'm not gone judgmentally with that person that I'm gone from. I'm gone recognizing that the energy doesn't work for me. My husband's really good at allowing me to do that, because I'll say to him, given this circumstance, I may not know what it's about. We build a little agreement between ourselves in terms of how long we're going to be there. We have a little signal, it's this. that will allow me to actually leave, because I seem to get full energetically way quicker than he does. But ultimately, the cool thing about being able to do this is that I'm supported, and he always knows it's not a judgment of who those people are. It's the energy that doesn't work for me. So that 3 years was recognizing what energy did I want to be around, right? Not what I didn't want to be around. This notion of that which we are against, right? That's which we resist persists. In this particular case, I wanted to be clear. What was the kind of energy I wanted to be around, right? I wanted it to be open. I wanted it to be safe. I wanted the energy to be reasonably fast, not slow, dark, and heavy like the energy that existed for the Dolans. So when I characterized and knew what kind of energy I was worthy of surrounding myself with, the time that I could spend with my family, with my mom, was really predicated on, did those energies exist? And if they did, I could stay for that hour and 17.